Isis, great of magic, the all-powerful cosmic goddess of heaven and earth, the star that brings the floods of the Nile, the mother of the pharaohs who leads the souls of the dead to eternity. At the same time, the favorite beloved by the lower classes, the goddess of the people, the most human of the gods. She's a tireless warrior in the fight against evil, lies and betrayal, thus embodying all virtues. She's the conscience of the Egyptians. The perfect sister, wife and mother, she is the main heroine of the Osirian myths, the most frequently quoted and the one who most often interacts with other gods. All this made her popularity grow and grow constantly until she became the supreme, universal goddess, and her cult spread far beyond the borders of Egypt. Hello everyone, my name's Irena. Welcome to my channel Ancient Side Girl. I invite you to a podcast about the history of ancient Egypt. Today, I'll tell you about the most famous Egyptian goddess, the main character of myths and legends. So before us a multitude of original ancient texts from different periods, among them incredible, engrossing stories, even shocking for the modern recipient. Isis, as we know, made the greatest career among the Egyptian gods, conquering the hearts of millions of inhabitants of the Roman Empire and even further. The history of the Greco-Roman Isis is a topic for another podcast. Today, we'll focus on the cult of the goddess in pharaonic Egypt. The ancient Egyptians generally didn't argue with each other on dogmatic issues, nor did they fight against the diversity of original religious traditions, which, as we know, were as numerous as anywhere else. On the contrary, they focused on combining them with each other, looking for common elements, theological concepts, which over time became the dogmas of their national religion. These included a universal respect for their once local and then major deities, such as Horus, Hathor, Ptah, Thoth, and the Great Ennead. This last group of first 9 gods was a theological concept born in the city of Iunu, called by the Greeks Heliopolis, located on the site of present-day Cairo, the ancient center of the solar cult in Egypt. There they worshipped the great creator god Atum, or Amun-ra, self-born from non-existence, from the primeval cosmic waters of chaos Nun. Atum in the first time Zep-Tepi performed the act of creation, starting with the first pair of gods, Shu and Tefnut. From the air and moisture, the earth and sky were then born, Geb and Nut, who brought into existence the last generation of the Ennead, their siblings Set and Nephthys, Osiris, and Isis. In short, they represent the male and female aspects of fertility and abundance, Osiris and Isis, and barrenness, Seth and Nephthys. Of course, the features and functions of these extremely popular gods multiplied over time. Since the solar Ennead was worshipped throughout the country already in the Pyramid Age, Isis was also a national deity at that time. Although the first written mention of her dates back to the time of the 5th dynasty pharaoh Nusra-Ini, the 25th century BC. Of the 4 siblings, only Seth was a truly ancient, prehistoric god of Egypt. The new cult of Osiris established by the rulers of the 5th dynasty included in the package the new goddess Isis. What was the Great Ennead itself if not a combination of several religious traditions? Isis and Osiris became the great-grandchildren of the great god Amun-ra and the parents of Horus himself. a new dogma was born. Isis is of course the Greek version of the goddess name. We don't know how the Egyptians pronounce it. It might have been Aset or Iset. According to some scholars, it was Yasit. Her name meant throne, which is by no means a coincidence. Isis in pharaonic iconography usually wears the hieroglyphic symbol of the throne on her head. Originally, she might have been a personification of the royal throne, which in the eyes of the Egyptians could be compared to the royal mother. The pharaoh sat on it like Horus, symbolizing him, on the lap of Isis, a motif so popular in Egyptian art. Isis is undoubtedly associated with kingship. She appears in the late Old Kingdom as the mother of the king, that is Horus. In the past, this role was associated with ancient Hathor, who in the Osirian myths is moved to the position of the spouse of Horus, who originally the early dynastic supreme god of the heavens. In the Osirian myths is shown as a vulnerable child, the son of the new god of the dead. The most recognizable image of Isis, her original image, is a young woman with a symbol of a throne on her head. In this form she'll always be shown in the mythological context of mourning the dead Osiris, watching over the remains of her brother with her sister Nephthys. However, as with many other gods, her image was changing over the centuries. In the New Kingdom, from the 16th century BC, Isis increasingly begins to take on the attributes of the most important solar goddess, Hathor, a crown with a solar disk between horns and a red dress. It's this image that will become dominant, and not only attributes but also functions previously attributed to the goddess Hathor will begin to be taken over by Isis. Hathor, an older deity, combined the prehistoric and seemingly universal Egyptian cult of the mother goddess, the great heavenly cow, with whom such primeval goddesses as Nut, Neith or Mehet-Weret were also identified. Isis as the great mother of Horus, the goddess of heaven, harvest and fertility associated with the floods of the Nile, in an obvious way joined this group. Isis' animal was therefore the cow, her more traditional, original animal from the times when her role was almost exclusively connected with the Osirian myth was the kite. And in this form she was supposed to search with her sister for the remains of Osiris, who'd been Seth's victim. Both sisters were often depicted as winged women, especially in funeral art. As a funeral deity, Isis was also the Lady of the Desert, as some Middle Kingdom Coffin Texts call her, so scorpions were also subject to her. As we'll see, numerous myths of which Isis was the main character referred to all these symbols. One of the myths describing probably the earliest times of the Great Ennead is the account of Isis stealing the secret name of the supreme god. The myth, written on the so-called Turin Papyrus 1993 from the Ramessid times, describes the story of the earthly reign of Ra, old and increasingly tired of ruling. The wise and cunning Isis decided to steal his secret name, the word that was the source of the creative power of the world. To do this, it was necessary to hurt the great god and then heal him at the price of revealing the secret. It wasn't easy because the entire creation had its source in his will. But something happened that the creator didn't wish. The old ruler salivated, and what's worse, he wasn't aware of it. This was a perfect opportunity for Isis. She collected his saliva and made a poisonous snake out of it, which according to plan bit the great god. Ra suffered terribly from pain, which he couldn't control because he didn't know what had bitten him. He didn't know the name of the creature, which hadn't been created by his will, so he couldn't counteract the venom. When all the gods failed, the cunning Isis offered her help, of course at the price of revealing the true name of the creator to her. Ra deceived her at first, but eventually gave in. Isis learned the highest word giving power over all creation, so she freed him from pain. The old god had to share his power with Isis from then on, who thus became the Lady of Magic, or Heka, power, as the Egyptians called it. The last god of the Ennead, the rightful king who was to rule on earth, was the just Osiris. His story, mainly death and its consequences, is described in the most popular and numerous Egyptian mythological stories. The wealth of sources and fascinating details of the Osirian myth are largely due to Isis, whose great popularity in the Roman world prompted Western authors, above all Plutarch, a Greek historian from the 1st century AD, to chronologically organize the Egyptian myth, to write it down. Although we learn the story of Osiris and Isis in the oldest religious text of Egypt, the pyramid text of the last ruler of the 5th dynasty Unas from the 24th century BC, as well as in many other pharaonic texts from different periods, Plutarch's version remains the most complete. A large part of Plutarch's Moralia is the book Isis and Osiris. Although his version seems to be often misinterpreted, too Hellenized, we reach for it to fill in the gaps in the old Egyptian sources. According to Plutarch, Isis and Osiris were enamored of each other and consorted together in the darkness of the womb, before their birth. They were therefore truly destined for each other, and their love would prove stronger than death. Of course, the second pair were Seth and Nephthys. In Plutarch's version, Osiris didn't limit himself to ruling over Egypt, but traveled around the world, civilizing other peoples. During his absence, Isis ruled. However, when the king returned to the country, his jealous brother Seth conspired against him. At the welcoming feast, he brought a magnificently decorated chest and announced that he would give it to whoever could fit in it. When Osiris began to prepare for it, the conspirators slammed the lid shut and threw the chest into the Nile, from where it drifted to the open sea. The sinful act of the usurper Seth, or Typhon as Plutarch called him, has disturbed the divine order and balance of Ma'at. His rule will prove to be a disaster for the earth and will provoke a great war among the gods. We read, Isis, when tidings reached her, at once cut off one of her tresses and put on a garment of mourning, in a place where the city still bears the name of Copto. Isis wandered everywhere at her wits' end. No one whom she approached did she fail to address, and even when she met some little children, she asked them about the chest. As it happened, they had seen it, and they told her the mouth of the river through which the friends of Typhon had launched the coffin into the sea. Wherefore the Egyptians think that little children possess the power of prophecy, and they try to divine the future from the portents which they find in the children's words. Thus begins Isis' epic journey. Wanting to protect the body of her drowned husband, she travels to distant Phoenicia, because the chest has drifted to Byblos, where it has miraculously become overgrown with the trunk of a massive tree. The impressive tree was cut down and served as a pillar to adorn the palace of the local ruler. Somehow, Isis finds this royal palace. To get inside, she showed great cleverness. Quote, she welcomed the queen's maidservants and treated them with great amiability, plaiting their hair for them and imparting to their persons a wondrous fragrance from her own body. But when the queen observed her maidservants, a longing came upon her for the unknown woman, and for such hairdressing, and for a body fragrant with ambrosia. Thus it happened that Isis was sent for and became so intimate with the queen that the queen made her the nurse of her baby. Ingenuity and cleverness definitely distinguish Isis from other gods of the Egyptian pantheon. Like no other deity, she always shows initiative. Her energy and charisma can turn even the most unfavorable circumstances to her advantage. At the same time, she remains emotional and therefore unpredictable, often to the doom of the mortals she meets, as we'll see. Plutarch continues. Isis nursed the child by giving it her finger to suck instead of her breast. Canned in the night, she would burn away the mortal portions of its body. She herself would turn into a swallow and flit about the pillar with a wailing lament, until the queen, who'd been watching when she saw her babe on fire, gave forth a loud cry and thus deprived it of immortality. Then the goddess disclosed herself and asked for the pillar, which served to support the roof. She removed it with the greatest ease and cut away the wood of the heather which surrounded the chest. Then, when she had wrapped up the wood in a linen cloth and had poured perfume upon it, she entrusted it to the care of the kings, and even to this day the people of Byblos venerate this wood, which is preserved in the shrine of Isis. Then the goddess threw herself down upon the coffin with such a dreadful wailing that the younger of the king's sons expired on the spot. The elder son she kept with her, and having placed the coffin on board a boat, she put out from land. In the first place where she found seclusion, when she was quite by herself, they relate that she opened the chest and laid her face upon the face within, and caressed it, and wept. The child came quietly up behind her and saw what was there. And when the goddess became aware of his presence, she turned about and gave him one awful look of anger. The child couldn't endure the fright and died. Isis hid the chest in the city of Buto in the Nile Delta, but it was found by Seth himself, who was hunting in the area. Then the king's body was cut into 14 parts, which were scattered throughout the country. Isis, of course, didn't give up and found almost all the remains in various Egyptian locations, where she established sanctuaries and shrines in honor of individual relics. In Plutarch's version of the myth, the only organ of Osiris that wasn't found was a male member, devoured by the Nile fish, Medjet. According to Plutarch, in memory of this event, Egyptians refrained from eating some Nile fish. However, fish weren't considered unclean, since the fish Medjet was sacred in the city of Per Medjet near Fayum, and shone with the characteristic horned sun disk of Isis. Interestingly, Isis, she who looks for the members of her brother on the floe, was identified with another fish, one of the few Egyptian fish goddesses, Hat Mehid, foremost of the fish, worshipped at Mendes in the delta. The missing but crucial organ of Osiris must have been copied by Isis from clay and then consecrated. In collecting and assembling the remains, she was assisted by her twin sister Nephthys, Anubis, and of course Thoth. It was widely believed that the reassembly of Osiris' body was the prototype of mummification. Both Isis and Nephthys were invoked during the embalming of the dead. The lamentation of Osiris by the sisters is one of the most popular motifs of Egyptian funeral art and literature. The songs and lamentations of Isis and Nephthys accompanied Egyptian religious festivals, were an important element of Osirian mysteries, and the roles of goddesses were taken on by two young girls, specially selected for this purpose. The Songs of Isis and Nephthys is a papyrus from the early 4th century BC. In addition to the songs, it describes instructions for the organizers of the festival of the two kites in Abydos. Quote, "The entire temple shall be sanctified, and there shall be brought in 2 women, pure of body and virgin, with the hair of their bodies removed, their heads adorned with wigs, tambourines in their hands, and their names inscribed on their arms, to wit, Isis and Nephthys, and they shall sing from the stanzas of this book in the presence of this god." The lamentations of Isis and Nephthys, sung during the festivals, were so popular that they eventually found their way into the funeral canon. Isis' primeval role as the Great Mourner leads some scholars to conclude that she was originally one of the funerary goddesses worshipped probably in the Nile Delta at Beit el-Hagar, the city known as Isiopoulos, where her temple functioned long before the famous sanctuary on the island of Philae in Upper Egypt. Anyway, 2 lamenting virgins were present as the coffin was lowered into its chamber through the shaft. Quote, "Come to the mistress of your house, for I am your sister by your own mother, and you shall not be far from me. The faces of gods and men are turned towards you, lamenting you in unison, while I can see I call upon you with tears, even to the height of heaven. But you don't hear my voice, although I am your sister, whom you loved upon earth, and you loved none other than me. Oh, my brother, my brother." The songs, lamentations, monologues, and dialogues of Isis concerning the finding of Osiris and mourning for the deceased were probably the most frequently quoted religious formulas of Egypt. Omnipresent already in the Middle Kingdom, circa 2000 BC, written down or rather literally reproduced in the Coffin Texts, they testify to the popularity of the mysteries, publicly performed scenes of the Osirian myth during the festivals by actors, like a modern Christmas nativity play. This popular folk religiosity associated with the Osirian mysteries must have influenced the popularity of Isis. Previously in the pyramid text, only mentioned almost exclusively together with Nephthys, now Isis became the favorite heroine of the Egyptians. She never acted in silence, like many other gods. This faithful, brave, resourceful, and inventive Isis was the most human of the goddesses. Initially having no canonical value, scenes shaped the religiosity of all Egyptians. Repeated, written stories eventually evolved into all that we today call Egyptian mythology, a subject so eagerly taken up by ancient Greek authors. However, the Greeks were shocked by some elements of this story. Namely, the already connected, embalmed corpse of Osiris is somewhat revived by Isis, but only enough to conceive a child with him. According to some sources, it was Osiris's mother, Nut, who gave him the breath of life. According to others, it was the work of Isis alone, who coupled with the half-dead god, shown sometimes as a kite or a vulture. Interestingly, this mythical episode was referred to when giving mummies an etephalic appearance, with a member held erect by a bandage and wads of linen. All this was probably to make Isis' task easier. The famous Tutankhamun had such a mummy. According to the Coffin Texts, spell 148, it was lightning that led to the conception of Horus. Quote, "The lightning flash strikes, the gods are afraid. Isis wakes pregnant with the seed of her brother Osiris." A miraculous lightning bolt instead of a member artificially prepared by the goddess. As in the Middle Kingdom, Isis' position wasn't yet so high that such a significant act could be attributed solely to her. The New Kingdom texts suggest that Isis became pregnant by means of a miraculous fluid that secreted from the embalmed body of Osiris. With the birth of Horus, the Osirian myth enters its second phase. Horus and his mother became undoubtedly the favorite heroes of Egyptian mythology, hence the wealth of tales, incantations, hymns, and prayers. According to the so-called Metternich stele from the 4th century BC, from the time of the 30th dynasty, Isis after the birth of Horus remained in captivity to Seth, working in a spinning mill, weaving bandages for the mummy of Osiris. Returning from work one day, she met the wise Thoth, who reminded her of her son's destiny and the danger he faced from his uncle. Quote, "Come, divine Isis, it is also good to hear to others, and one lives when the other leads him. Why don't you hide with the young son, that he may come to us, the gods, once his limbs are firm, and all his powers have been created, and you let him sit down on his throne by granting him the office of ruler of the two countries." So the divine wisdom itself, which the ibis-headed Thoth represented, decided that Isis should flee, so she set off one night to the north, to the Nile Delta, accompanied by 7 scorpions, who were to guard and guide her. They brought her to a city on the edge of the marshes. In front of one of the first houses they came across, Isis and Horus saw a woman, who, however, didn't grant the goddess hospitality, but, terrified by the sight of her companions, closed the door on her. This angered the scorpions. One of them, named Teften, crept under the door and punished the woman by biting her son. Such a wicked act aroused the indignation of the gods so strong that the entire house was filled with flames, which were then miraculously extinguished. We read, "Heaven sent down rain upon the house of the mistress, although it wasn't the season for it, and although she hadn't opened the door for me, and her heart was very troubled, for she didn't know if he would leave. She filled her town with lamentation, and no one answered her cry." Also, Isis herself didn't remain indifferent to the fate of the child. We read, "And my own heart was troubled for the little one because of it, how to make the innocent one live. And I called to her, saying, 'Come to me, behold, life is in my mouth. I am a daughter famous in her town for driving away reptiles with her spells, which my father taught me to know, for I am his own beloved daughter.'" The daughter of the Great Geb cried out, then began to massage the child while reciting powerful spells. Quote, "Poison of Tefn, come forth, flow on the ground. Do not penetrate, do not enter in. Poison of Bethan, come forth on the ground. I am Isis, the goddess, mistress of magic, who makes magic, glorious of speech. Every reptile who stings listens to me. Isis, great of magic before the gods, has spoken, to whom Geb has given his magic to repulse poison. Poison, be powerless, retreat, flee back." Of course, the boy was healed, but soon the same fate, a deadly scorpion bite, befell her own child, little Horus. It happened near Heliopolis. When Isis realized that her child was unconscious, she desperately called for help, and the local peasants ran together, but no one knew how to help the infant. This time the mighty goddess proved helpless against her poisoned son. Shaking the child, she called upon the gods for help. Quote, "Horus has been stung. O Ra, thy son has been stung. Horus, the heir of your heir, has been stung. The child has been stung, the beautiful golden child, the orphan without a father. Horus, the son of Osiris, has been stung, without sin, youngest son of the gods." Isis' moving appeal was answered by her faithful friend Thoth, sent by the Great Ennead. The mighty god threatened that, quote, "It will be dark, and the light will be driven away until Horus is cured for his mother Isis." Interestingly, according to some sources, it wasn't Geb, but Thoth who was the biological father of Isis, so his involvement in her cause is not surprising. Baby Horus survived, raised by his mother carefully among the papyrus and reeds of the Nile Delta, whose inhabitants became his most loyal supporters. Years passed. Young Horus grew up, prepared by his mother for the battle to regain Osiris' throne. He gathered around himself a growing group of gods, dissatisfied with Seth's destructive and unjust rule. Osiris was already the all-powerful ruler of Duat, the land of the dead. He gave advice from the afterlife and examined the state of his son's preparations for the final battle with the usurper. The battle with Seth is vividly described in several sources, starting with the Pyramid Texts. However, they didn't bring a resolution. Ultimately, the warring parties decided to settle the dispute before the Tribunal of the Gods, led by Ra, an open supporter of Seth. Most of the gods, however, seemed to recognize Horus's rights to the throne. This version of events is given in the famous Chester Beatty Papyrus I, dated to the 20th dynasty, circa 12th century BC. It's a hieratic text called the Contendings of Horus and Seth. When there was a difference of opinion among the divine tribunal about Horus's right to the throne, the restless Isis protested with these words: "By my mother Neith, the goddess, and by Ptah Tatanen, who restrains the horns of the gods, these matters should be brought before Atum, the great prince who is in Heliopolis, and also before Khepri, who dwells in his bark." And the Ennead said to her, "Do not be angry, the laws will be given to him who is right. All that you have said will be done." It was then that Seth, a hot-tempered and powerful warrior, unrivaled in battle, realized that his sister was the greatest obstacle to maintaining power. He demanded that she be excluded from further trial. Quote, "And then Seth took an oath by the universal Lord, saying, 'I shall not go to law in the tribunal while Isis is still in it.' Said Rahorachti to them, 'You shall ferry across to the island in the middle and decide between them there, and tell Nephthys the ferryman not to ferry any woman across resembling Isis.'" So all the gods took a ferry to the island to continue their discussion there without Isis. However, as we already know, Isis doesn't give up easily. In the form of an old woman, Horus' mother approached the ferryman. Quote, "You might ferry me across to the island in the middle, that I come to you, because it is for the young lad that I have come carrying this bowl full of porridge, since he has been tending some cattle on the island in the middle for 5 days now and is hungry." He said to her, "I've been told not to ferry any woman across." But she said to him, "It's with reference to Isis that you've been told this which you have just mentioned." He said to her, "What will you give me in order that you may be ferried across to the island in the middle?" Isis said to him, "I'll give you this cake." He said to her, "What good is it to me, your cake? Is it in exchange for your cake that I should ferry you across to the island in the middle, when I have been told not to ferry any woman across?" Then she said to him, "I will give you the golden ring which is on my hand." And he said to her, "Hand over the golden ring." And she gave it to him. Then he ferried her across to the island in the middle. Well, it wasn't that hard, was it? When Isis watched the gods feasting in the pavilion of Ra, she decided to perform another magical feat. This time she transformed herself into the most beautiful girl in the whole land and positioned herself so that only Seth could see her. Overcome with desire, he ran to the girl, but she began to complain to him. Quote, "I was the wife of a herder to whom I bore one son. My husband died, and the boy began to look after his father's cattle. But then a stranger came and took up residence in my stable. He said, addressing my son, 'I'll beat you and confiscate your father's cattle and throw you out.' Then Seth said to her, 'As long as a man's son lives, shall the cattle be given to a stranger?' So Isis transformed herself into a kite and sat on the top of an acacia tree. She said to Seth, 'Be ashamed. It's your own mouth that has spoken this. It's your own wisdom that has judged you.'" Seth rather unwisely complained to Ra, repeating in detail the entire conversation with Isis. "You have judged yourself," said Ra, reluctantly agreeing with Isis. As we know, Seth was his companion on a nocturnal journey through the land of the dead, the defender of the sunbark, the slayer of the sun's eternal enemy, the serpent Apep. Seth landed his anger on the poor ferryman, cutting off his legs. Despite the demands of the great creator god Atum and the other judges, Ra didn't yet recognize Horus as king and allowed another duel. In the form of hippopotami, they were to remain underwater for 3 months. Isis didn't watch passively. She turned a skein of yarn into a harpoon, attacking one of the hippopotami, accidentally hitting her son. The second time she hit Seth, but he managed to arouse her pity. Suffering great pain, he cried out, "What have I done against you, my sister Isis? I am your maternal brother, Isis." Then she felt exceedingly compassionate toward him. Horus was furious at his mother's unexpected betrayal, and he jumped out of the water and cut off her head with a large cleaver, holding it in his arms and running away in a frenzy into the mountains. The outraged gods chased Horus, but Seth found him blinded and left him for dead. He was saved by Ra's daughter, Hathor, who restored his sight and calmed the situation. The text is silent about the healing of the decapitated Isis, but other, later versions of the myth state that after reviving her, the gods offer her a cow's head in place of the one she had lost. Harmony between mother and son was restored. Ra also desired harmony, so he ordered Set and Horus to take a break from fighting. So his uncle invited his young rival to a feast in his house and clearly tried to seduce him. Horus reported this to his mother, to which she replied, "Be careful. Do not approach him. When he mentions it to you a second time, say to him, 'This is difficult for me because of my nature, because you are too heavy. My strength will not be equal to yours,' you will say to him. And when he forces you, put your hand between your buttocks." Of course, Seth used force, and Horus, in despair, ran to his mother again, showing her his defiled hands. She, screaming with despair, immediately cut off her son's hands. In revenge, the cunning Isis obtained Horus's seed and handed it to the latter's, which Seth eagerly ate. When they stood before the tribunal of the gods again, Seth revealed to everyone what he had done to Horus the previous night. This was to finally disqualify his opponent in his efforts to claim the throne of Osiris. Horus, despite the cries of condemnation, laughed and denied everything. Let the seed of Seth be called, that we may see from whence he answers, and let my own be called, that we may see from whence he answers, he replied. Thoth willingly undertook this task, calling upon the seed of Seth. He heard the answer from a nearby swamp. The seed of Horus, on the other hand, answered from within Seth. Horus is right, the gods collectively cried, but Seth forced another duel, which he lost. The great Atum therefore commanded Isis, "Bring Seth restrained with manacles." Isis brought Seth restrained with manacles as a prisoner. Atum said to him, "Why do you not allow yourself to be judged, but instead usurp the throne of Horus?" Seth said to him, "On the contrary, my good lord, let Horus, son of Isis, be granted the throne of his father Osiris." And so the wrongs were righted, divine order and balance restored, and the rightful ruler returned to the throne. Not without the help of the wise Isis. As the archetype of the perfect, caring mother, Isis took care of children. As a divine midwife, she and Nephthys were present at the Egyptian births. She took special care of boys, protecting them with her magical words and amulets, just as the mythological Horus child. Egyptian girls were traditionally protected by the Eye of Ra, the beloved daughter of the sun god. Since religion was omnipresent in Egyptian life, children were also given new divine guardians as they grew up, as they were trained in the professions inherited from their parents. Isis would then give way to Ptah when the boy became a craftsman, Thoth when he became a scribe, and Montu when he became a soldier. The young men would again turn to Isis and Osiris in marriage matters, as each couple tried to imitate this divine model, including the traditional address of sister in pharaonic Egypt to the wife, who in turn called her husband brother. Egyptian marriage was indissoluble, even after death, both in the grave, where the kas of both spouses resided, and in the afterlife, where their justified bas were still connected. Wives bearing their husbands took on the role of the grieving Isis, their sons of the young Horus. The family of the deceased and hired mourners, the so-called kites of Nephthys, raised a collective lament taken from the mythical mourning of Osiris. Like Isis mourning her husband, the widow covered her face with long disheveled hair and threw dust and ashes over her head. Imitating the goddesses, the mourners performed magical gestures, such as hands crossed over the heart or arms stretched out towards the deceased, symbolically covering the deceased with the wings of two kites, as the divine sisters did for Osiris. Isis' role as a protective deity didn't end with death. Her key role as guide of the soul of the deceased pharaoh is already present in the pyramid texts, where she was identified with the early dynastic goddess Sobdet, or Sothis as the Greeks called her, personification of the brightest star in the night sky, Sirius, whose heliacal rising preceded the annual flooding of the Nile. Her consort represented the constellation Orion, Sah, the father of the gods, obviously identified with Osiris. The dead pharaoh had traveled to Orion after his death, Orion who was the soul of Osiris and was led there by the soul of Isis, Sirius. Iset Sobdet, Wusir Sah, the deceased king, all the gods and celestial bodies moved through the heavens in celestial boats. The Egyptians generally believed that the heavens were a vast body of water. In order for the heliacal rising of Sirius to occur in the 12th month of the Egyptian lunar calendar, epagomenal days were introduced, 5 days upon the year, the last days of the old year, a time of waiting and uncertainty, a time of low waters and heat. According to the legend passed down by Plutarch, the goddess Nut, unhappily in love with her brother Geb, the god of the earth, was forbidden to unite with him for the entire Egyptian year, that is 360 days. The compassionate god of wisdom, Thoth, therefore added 5 days outside of time to the year, during which Nut conceived her children. Isis was born on the 4th day of Per-Uranpet, between the years. The appearance of Isis Sobdet in the sky began the month of Thoth, the first month of the flood season, Akhet. When the constellation of Orion first appeared on the horizon, it reminded the Egyptians of Osiris lying on his back, being lifted up by Sirius Isis, rising just below him, lifting Osiris in the sky just as the pharaoh lifts the column of jet. Of course, every Egyptian wanted to achieve salvation and eternal life, while in the Old Kingdom this was the perspective of kings. Already in the Middle Kingdom, all the dead, regardless of their social status, could become Osiris. In order to defeat death like their god-savior, they also needed Isis, the one who breathes life into their dead bodies. Isis was therefore associated with the Lady of the Sycamore, who took care of the souls traveling to the west, and she was also associated with Imentet, she of the west, personifying the necropolises on the western side of the Nile, shown with the hieroglyph for west on her head. The texts of the Book of the Dead, sometimes attributed to Isis, attest to the use of amulets and magical spells of Isis to survive in the dangerous land of the dead, the Duat. In the Ramessid Book of the Dead belonging to a man called Ani, we read, "The Osiris Ani, whose word is truth, said, the blood of Isis, the spells of Isis, the magical powers of Isis shall make this great one strong, and shall be an amulet of protection against him that would do to him the things which he abomineth." The blood of Isis refers to the red jasper or carnelian from which the popular amulet Tiet, or knot of Isis, was made. Given to the dead, hidden under the bandages of the mummy, it was supposed to give him the power of Isis and safeguard his limbs. Tiet resembled the symbol of the Ankh, except that its arms curved downward. The popular goddess had many temples throughout Egypt. Her oldest and one of the largest sanctuaries was the so-called Iseion at Behbet el-Hagara, in the heart of the Nile Delta. The now vanished late-period temple, built entirely of granite, probably stood on the site of a much older one, since Isis was already associated with this region in the pyramid texts. Her most famous sanctuary, however, was the temple on the island of Philae, located on the Nile, in present-day Aswan. It was the last bastion of Egyptian paganism, the last stronghold of the pharaonic religion, still functioning in the 5th century AD. On the site of the former temples on the island of Philae, a huge temple complex was built in Ptolemaic and Roman times. Of course, the great main temple belonged to Isis, but Horus and Hathor also had their temples there. Plutarch wrote about this holy place. They also say that the sacred island by Philae at all other times is untrodden by men and quite unapproachable, and even birds do not alight on it nor fishes approach it. I must admit that this is one of the most beautiful places I've been to in Egypt. The buildings aren't ruins, but perfectly preserved pharaonic-like structures, located in a truly fairy tale setting. In Aswan, the Nile is most beautiful. The proximity of the first cataract is announced by countless islets. Towering granite boulders rise from the water and please the eyes, although they make navigation difficult. It's here that the last known hymn, written in hieroglyphs from the end of the 4th century, is located. Despite the edict of the Roman Emperor Theodosius the Great, banning all pagan cults in the empire, an exception was made for Isis, perhaps thanks to the Nubians from the kingdom of Nubatia in Lower Nubia, who were faithful to the old beliefs, to whom the Romans made the sanctuary available and even temporarily lent the cult statue of the great goddess in order to avoid invasions on the southern borders of the empire. It wasn't until 535 AD that Emperor Justinian the Great finally closed this last temple of Egyptian gods and turned it into a church. Many of its reliefs were destroyed at that time. But the real disaster for the temple was the damming of the Nile in 1902. The construction of a dam on the Nile flooded the sanctuary, and the erecting of another dam 60 years later meant the loss of the island of Philae forever. So the temple of Isis was cut into pieces and moved to nearby Agilike Island. Other temples are currently deep underwater, lost forever. Of course, at the time when this last pagan temple was closed, both Egypt and the entire Roman Empire had already been largely Christianized. Christianity triumphed over other religions, of which until recently the cult of Isis, the great and universal goddess of Egypt, had been developing most dynamically. She gained followers all over the known world. Her temples were built from England to India. The vast history of the powerful religion of Isis in Greco-Roman times will be the subject of another podcast. The astonishing popularity of the goddess is best explained by her story, moving, absorbing like a good novel. She was the main character of Egyptian myths, the sister, wife, mother, this Isis. Plutarch wrote, "The Avenger, the sister and wife of Osiris, after she had quenched and suppressed the madness and fury of Typhon, wasn't indifferent to the contests and struggles which she had endured, nor to her own wanderings, nor to her manifold deeds of wisdom and many feats of bravery, nor would she accept oblivion and silence for them, but she intermingled in the most holy rites, portrayals and suggestions and representations of her experiences at that time, and sanctified them, both as a lesson in godliness and an encouragement of all men and women who find themselves in the clutch of like calamities." I hope you learned something new about the beliefs of ancient Egyptians. Thank you for listening. Please let me know in the comments what you would like to hear about next time. I'd also like to thank all my patrons. I truly appreciate your contribution. Thank you so much. And if you don't support me yet but would like to, I placed my Patreon link below in the description. Don't forget to like my video and subscribe to my channel. Goodbye, and see you on the next one.